The morning Earl Denton decided to clear out the back 40 of his father's property, he wasn't looking for anything. He wasn't hopeful. He wasn't sentimental. He was tired, he was 67 years old, and he had a bad knee that had been telling him for 3 years that it was time to slow down. But the property taxes on that land weren't slowing down with him, and the brush along the back fence line had grown so thick that the county had sent him a second notice about it. So he got up before the sun, drank his coffee black the way he always had, pulled on his work boots, and walked out into a morning that smelled like rain, and turned earth and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in the middle of Kansas before the rest of the world remembers it's awake. His father, Harold Denton, had died 14 months earlier at the age of 89. Harold had farmed that ground for 61 years. He'd bought it young, worked it hard, and in his later decades had done what a lot of men of that generation did. He'd stopped throwing things away. Not out of laziness, out of habit, out of a deep, bone-level belief that if something had been made right the first time, it still had value, even if that value wasn't visible yet. Harold Denton had grown up in a time when nothing came easy and nothing got wasted, and that philosophy had soaked into every corner of his operation, including the back of his property, where decades of equipment, lumber, scrap iron, and things that had no immediate name had been pushed, stacked, covered, and more or less forgotten. Earl had been out to that part of the property a handful of times over the years, usually to chase cattle or fix fence. He'd never paid much attention to what was back there. It was just the accumulation of a long life, old cultivator frames, a hay rake missing 2 wheels, stacks of locust fence posts that had gone gray and brittle, coils of wire that had rusted into single solid masses. The kind of things you look at and think, someday, and someday never comes. But now the county was watching and the taxes were due, and Earl Denton was the only one left to deal with it. So he walked back there with a chainsaw, a set of bolt cutters, and no particular expectations. He started at the north fence and worked south, cutting brush, pulling wire, rolling debris into piles he'd burn later in the week when the wind was right. The work was slow and physical, and he fell into the rhythm of it the way a man does when there's nothing left to do but work. He wasn't thinking about anything specific. He was just moving, cutting, clearing, the way you do when the job is bigger than your energy, and the only way through it is to stop thinking about the whole and just deal with the piece in front of you. He was about 2 hours in, maybe 200 yards behind the main equipment shed, when the brush cutter he was running caught on something solid and stopped hard. He thought it was a buried fence post at first. He backed off, went in with the blade at a different angle, hit the same resistance. He killed the machine and crouched down, pulling brush aside with his gloved hands. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the vegetation was thick and tangled, the kind of growth that takes decades to establish. He pulled and cut and cleared for about 10 minutes before he saw the iron. It was dark with age and thick with rust, but it was unmistakably machined. A large diameter flywheel, partially submerged in the soft ground, its spokes still intact. He cleared more brush. There was a boiler barrel beneath it, long, horizontal, lying on its side at a slight angle where the ground had settled beneath it over the years. He cleared more. A firebox door, drive chains, seized solid but present. He stood up and looked at what he had in front of him, and it took him a long moment before the shape of it resolved into something he recognized. It was a steam traction engine, an old one, a very old one. Earl Denton was not a collector. He was not an antique machinery enthusiast. He didn't subscribe to those magazines or go to the shows or know the names of the manufacturers the way some men did. But he had grown up around old iron, and he knew what he was looking at in the general sense, even if he couldn't tell you the make or the year. He stood there in the morning light, brush piled around him, bad knee aching, and looked at that machine for a long time. Then he walked back to the house, poured himself another cup of coffee, and tried to figure out what, if anything, you were supposed to do with something like that. He called his neighbor Dale Fricke first, mostly because Dale was the kind of man who knew things, or knew someone who knew things, which in rural Kansas amounts to the same currency. Dale came over that afternoon, walked back to the machine, circled it twice without saying anything, then crouched down and started looking at the manufacturer's plate on the firebox. The plate was corroded but readable. Dale took out his phone and photographed it. He stood up and said, "That's a case. Could be 1911, could be 1913. Hard to say without cleaning the plate. But that's a case steam traction engine, and it's more complete than it has any right to be after sitting out here this long." Earl asked him what that meant in practical terms. Dale said he honestly didn't know. Could be scrap value, could be a lot more than that. He told Earl not to cut anything, not to move anything, not to do anything with it until he made a phone call. Earl said fine. Dale made his phone call that evening and called Earl back inside an hour. The man Dale had spoken to, a dealer in Wichita who moved antique and specialty farm equipment to a private collector network, wanted to come out and look at it himself. Dale told Earl, "Don't get your hopes up, but don't sell it for scrap either." The dealer's name was Ron Schaefer. He drove out 2 days later in a late-model pickup, walked the property to the back without much conversation, and spent 45 minutes examining the machine in a focused, methodical way that told Earl this was not a casual visit. Schaefer got down on the ground and looked at the undercarriage. He checked the condition of the boiler barrel by feel and by eye. He found and photographed every casting mark he could locate. He dug carefully around the firebox to check the door hardware. He didn't say much while he was working, and Earl had enough sense not to push him. When Schaefer finally stood up and walked back to where Earl was waiting, he had a look on his face that wasn't excitement exactly. It was more the careful neutrality of a man who has learned not to show his hand too early. He said, "Mr. Denton, this is a 1912 Case 65 horsepower steam traction engine. The manufacturer's plate confirms the year and the horsepower rating. The boiler and firebox are intact, which is the part that most of these lose first, either to rust through or to people cutting them up for the steel. The drive mechanism is seized but present. The flywheel is undamaged. For a machine that has been sitting exposed for what looks like 50 or 60 years, the condition is," he paused, "the condition is remarkable." Earl asked him what it was worth. Schaefer said that depended on the buyer and the restoration level, but that in the private collector market he served, a machine like this, complete, correct year, identifiable provenance, was not a scrap transaction. Earl asked him to be more specific. Schaefer said he'd need to make some calls, but that he had 2 buyers in his network who had been looking for intact Case steam engines for years. He said, "I won't insult you with a number today. Let me go back and have some conversations, and I'll come back to you with something real." He came back 4 days later. This time he came with paperwork. What Schaefer proposed was a trade, not a cash sale. He represented a regional Massey Ferguson dealership group as a secondary business, moving quality used equipment to working operators in addition to his collector network dealings. What he offered Earl Denton was this: 11 Massey Ferguson tractors, a mix of utility and row crop configurations, all late model, all serviced, titles clean, in exchange for the 1912 Case steam engine, transported at Schaefer's expense. The collector on the receiving end of the steam engine would be paying Schaefer a figure that made the trade viable. Earl would receive working equipment. Schaefer would take his margin from the collector side. Earl sat at his kitchen table and looked at the paperwork for a long time. He was not a man who made fast decisions. He'd watched his father make fast decisions twice in his life, once when grain prices spiked in the late 70s and Harold had over-leveraged on land, and once in the mid-80s when he'd taken a dealer's word on a piece of equipment without reading the service history. Both times it had cost him. Earl had learned from watching. He told Schaefer he needed a day. Schaefer said take 2. Earl spent those 2 days doing what any serious farmer should do before signing anything. He called the Massey Ferguson dealer Schaefer was affiliated with and confirmed the relationship was legitimate. He had Dale Fricka look over the list of machines and the listed service records. He called a farm equipment attorney he'd used once before for a land transaction and had the trade agreement reviewed. Everything came back clean. The machines were real, the titles were clear, the agreement was straightforward. On the morning of the 3rd day, Earl Denton signed the paperwork. The reaction from his neighbors was not immediate, because Earl didn't tell anyone immediately. That was his way. He'd sign the papers on a Tuesday morning. By Friday afternoon, the first 4 Massey Ferguson tractors were on the delivery truck coming up his drive. By the following Wednesday, all 11 had been delivered, inspected, and parked in his equipment yard. It was his neighbor's wife, driving past on the county road, who first noticed the machines. She mentioned it to her husband that evening. Her husband drove over on Saturday morning and stood in Earl's equipment yard looking at 11 Massey Fergusons in a row and asked Earl what in the world had happened. Earl told him the story simply, without embellishment, the way he told most things. The neighbor listened, asked a few questions, and then was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So that thing sitting back there in the brush for 50 years, that was worth 11 tractors." Earl said, "Apparently so." The neighbor looked at the machines again and said, "Your daddy must have known something." Earl didn't respond to that directly. But later, walking back through the property to look at the cleared ground where the steam engine had sat, he thought about it. He didn't think Harold Denton had known anything specific. He didn't think his father had hidden that machine intentionally or understood what it would someday be worth. Harold had simply done what he always did. Left it alone, didn't cut it up, didn't haul it to the salvage yard, didn't make a hasty decision just because something wasn't useful in the moment. He'd left it there because throwing things away was a habit Harold Denton had never acquired. And that single habit, carried across 6 decades without any particular intention, had produced 11 working Massey Ferguson tractors on a Tuesday afternoon in March. That's a harder thing to explain to people than it sounds. Because the instinct in modern agriculture, in any modern industry, really, is to move fast. Clear the clutter. Liquidate the non-productive assets. Don't let dead weight drag on the balance sheet. There are consultants who will come to your farm and tell you exactly that, and some of what they say is right. But what they can't account for is the thing they can't see the value in. Harold Denton couldn't see the value in that steam engine. Neither could Earl, not for the first 67 years of his life. But the value was there anyway, waiting, indifferent to whether anyone recognized it. The 11 Massey Fergusons changed Earl's operation in ways that were both obvious and less obvious. The obvious part was capacity. He'd been running a 2-tractor operation for years, renting additional equipment during planting and harvest peaks, paying rates that had been climbing every season. With 11 machines, he had capacity he'd never had before. He could put the right tractor on the right job without moving equipment across the farm to cover for what he didn't have. He could lend equipment to Dale Fricke during crunch periods in exchange for labor, which was a trade that suited both men. He could take on custom work for neighbors during their peak seasons and generate additional income from machines that were otherwise sitting. The less obvious part was what it did to his planning horizon. A man who is perpetually short on equipment makes short decisions. He takes what he can get at rental time. He doesn't turn down a field that's too wet because he can't afford to wait. He runs anyway and deals with compaction damage for the next 3 years. He plants late because the equipment he needed wasn't available when he needed it. He harvests into weather he shouldn't because he doesn't have the capacity to fit a finish before the window closes. Equipment shortage doesn't just cost you in rental fees. It costs you in every compromised decision it forces you to make across an entire season. Earl had been living inside that constraint for years. Now he wasn't. He planted that spring with his own equipment on his own schedule. He ran a Massey Ferguson 7700 series on his primary ground and put 2 of the smaller utility tractors to work on fencing and infrastructure repairs he'd been putting off for years because he'd never had the manpower and machinery to do them at the same time as his main field work. He finished planting 4 days ahead of where he'd been the previous 2 seasons. The ground conditions were better because he hadn't rushed. The seed placement was more consistent because he wasn't racing a rental deadline. Dale Fricke borrowed 2 of the machines during his own planting window and returned them serviced. That was the arrangement. Borrow the iron, return it better than you found it. Dale was the kind of man who understood that arrangement without being told twice. The two of them had been neighbors for 30 years and had the kind of working relationship that doesn't need a contract because the contract is written in mutual respect and decades of kept promises. The summer was dry across most of the county, which hurt a lot of operators who had planted late into stressed soil. Earl's ground, planted earlier into better moisture conditions, held up comparatively well. He didn't have a record year. Nobody had a record year that summer. But he came out the other side of it in better shape than most, and the difference, tracing it back, came down to that spring planting window he hadn't been forced to compromise. Word had spread through the county by that point about how he'd come by the machines. Stories have a way of moving in rural communities, particularly stories that involve a number. 11 tractors is a specific enough number that it sticks in the memory and gets repeated accurately. Some people told the story with admiration. Some told it with a kind of uncomfortable envy, the feeling you get when someone else's luck makes you reconsider your own choices. A few told it with skepticism, as if the cleanness of the trade must mean something was being left out, some hidden cost or complication that hadn't surfaced yet. There was a man at the grain elevator in late August. A younger operator, mid-40s, had been farming aggressively on borrowed capital for the past several years, who said to Earl directly, "Must be nice to stumble into a fleet like that." Earl looked at him for a moment and then said, "That steam engine sat on my family's property for over 50 years. My father didn't cut it up, and my grandfather didn't cut it up before him, and I didn't cut it up either. That's not stumbling. That's 3 generations of not making a stupid decision." The younger man didn't have much to say to that. The steam engine itself left on a flatbed truck on a gray morning in April, about 3 weeks after the paperwork was signed. Earl watched them load it, a process that took most of the morning and required a crane truck in addition to the flatbed, because the machine weighed somewhere in the range of 16 tons, even in its deteriorated state. It was a slow and careful operation, and Earl watched it from a distance, not from sentimentality exactly, but because it felt like the kind of thing a man should watch. That machine had been on his family's land his entire life and most of his father's life, and it was leaving now, and wherever it was going it would be cleaned and preserved and looked at by people who understood what it was. That seemed like the right outcome for it, better than rusting into the ground behind a brush line. He walked back to that spot a few weeks later, after the ground had dried out from the wet spring. The indentation where the boiler had rested was still visible, a long, shallow depression in the earth where the weight had compressed the soil over decades. The vegetation around it was growing back already, the way it does. In a year, it would look like any other part of the pasture. In 10 years, there would be no visible sign at all that anything had ever been there. That's how it goes with most things. Earl Denton farmed that ground for 4 more years after that spring, before his knee made the decision for him, and he brought his youngest son back into the operation on a formal basis. By the time he stepped back from the day-to-day work, he had reduced the fleet to 7 machines, the ones that best fit the operation, and sold the remaining 4 at auction. Clean titles, well-maintained, good hours on all of them. The machines he sold brought fair prices because they had been looked after, which is the only way Massey Ferguson equipment should be sold. Used hard, maintained right, and worth what they ask at the end of it. His son took over an operation in better condition than Earl had inherited it, which is the only real metric that matters when you're talking about passing something down. Harold Denton had passed a farm with problems and a steam engine in the brush to Earl. Earl was passing a farm with capacity, clean equipment, and a son who knew the difference between a good decision and a fast one. The 1912 Case steam engine, as far as Earl ever learned through Schaefer, went to a private collection in Colorado. It was fully restored over a period of about 2 years by a specialist who documented the process. It runs under its own power now, demonstrated at private events for collectors and agricultural historians. The restoration photos that made their way back to Earl through Schaefer showed a machine that looked nothing like what he had pulled out of the brush. Gleaming canopy, painted iron, polished fittings, the flywheel turning the way it was designed to turn 112 years ago. Earl looked at those photos for a long time. He thought about what it had taken to get that machine from a corrugated tin shelter on a Kansas farm in the early 20th century to a collection in Colorado in the 21st. The chain of decisions, mostly non-decisions, the accumulated restraint of men who didn't reach for the cutting torch when something stopped being immediately useful. He thought about his father, who had never said a word about that machine in all the years Earl could remember, had simply left it there as he'd found it, a habit of preservation carried forward without explanation. He set the photos down on the kitchen table and looked out the window at his equipment yard, where two of his Massey Fergusons were visible from where he sat, parked in the lean-to shed his grandfather had built and his father had repaired, and he himself had re-roofed twice. Good machines, properly sheltered, ready to work. That was the whole of it. That was what a farm was supposed to look like. He drank the last of his coffee and went back to work.